December 22nd, 1944. Private Danny Cole couldn't feel his fingers anymore. Around him, the Ardennes forest glittered with ice, beautiful and lethal. 2 men in his squad had already been evacuated with frostbite. The Army-issued wool coat was useless against Belgian winter, but 30 feet away, slumped against a tree, a dead German soldier wore something that looked warm. Very warm. Danny knew the regulation. U.S. personnel will not wear enemy uniforms or insignia under any circumstances. Violation meant court-martial. But Danny also knew frostbite meant amputation, and dead men didn't care about their coats, so he made a choice that would either save his hands or end his military career. This is the story of how one soldier survived winter by breaking the most visible rule in the Army, and why nobody talks about how many others did the same thing. Before we continue, if you're interested in the untold practical stories of World War II that nobody teaches, hit subscribe. These stories don't appear in textbooks. The problem started long before Danny Cole arrived in Belgium. It started in procurement offices in Washington, where men who'd never experienced European winter made decisions about what American soldiers would wear. The standard issue M1943 field jacket was a marvel of mass production. Cotton outer shell, wool liner, designed to be manufactured quickly and distributed widely. It worked adequately in moderate cold. In Belgian December, it was a death sentence. The human body loses heat in predictable ways, extremities first, fingers, toes, nose, ears. The body prioritizes core temperature, sacrificing peripheral circulation to keep vital organs functioning. When tissue temperature drops below freezing, ice crystals form inside cells. The cells rupture. The tissue dies. First, it turns white, then gray, then black. By the time it turns black, amputation is the only option. Danny had seen the progression. Charlie Morrison was the first. Good soldier, careful about his gear, never complained. One morning in mid-December, Charlie couldn't get his boots on. His toes had swollen overnight, turned purple-black. The medic took one look and called for evacuation. 3 days later, word came back. Charlie had lost 4 toes on his left foot, 3 on his right. Then came Jackson, then Rodriguez, both with finger damage severe enough for medical evacuation. The squad was being destroyed not by German bullets, but by weather the Army had apparently decided wasn't a significant threat. The irony was impossible to ignore. Dead German soldiers lay scattered across the battlefield, and every single one wore better winter gear, thicker wool, proper insulation, coats that actually kept men warm. The Germans had learned their lessons on the Russian front, where winter killed more soldiers than combat. They'd engineered their equipment accordingly. American soldiers noticed. How could they not? Every patrol, every position, every frozen foxhole, the evidence was right there. The enemy was dressed for winter. The Americans were dressed for autumn. But regulations were clear. Do not take, wear, or utilize enemy equipment without proper authorization. The reasons made sense in theory. Friendly fire risk, chain of command integrity, maintaining unit cohesion and discipline. In practice, men were losing fingers they'd never get back. Danny's platoon sergeant, a career Army man named Kowalski, addressed the issue exactly once. He gathered the squad one morning after Rodriguez's evacuation and said 7 words. "Keep your goddamn hands in your pockets." That was it. No mention of German gear, no acknowledgement that half the squad was already wearing scavenged gloves or scarves hidden under regulation uniforms. Just a practical instruction that everyone understood. Keep your hands warm, however you have to. Danny tried everything regulation approved first. He stuffed newspaper inside his gloves for extra insulation. Didn't help. He wrapped his hands in undershirts before putting gloves on. Barely made a difference. He requested additional cold weather gear through proper channels. The request went nowhere. Supply sergeants had nothing to give. The equipment simply didn't exist in sufficient quantities. Meanwhile, the temperature kept dropping. By December 20th, nighttime temperatures were hitting 10 degrees Fahrenheit. By the 22nd, it was worse. Danny could see his breath freeze in the air, Every morning he'd wake up and check his fingers. Still there, still moving. But the sensation was fading. The tips were starting to feel wooden, distant, like they belonged to someone else. That's when he noticed the coat. The German soldier had been dead for maybe 2 days, killed in a skirmish Danny's squad hadn't even participated in. Someone else's battle, someone else's casualty. The body had been left where it fell, slumped against a tree about 30 yards from Danny's position. Nobody had bothered to move it. There were too many bodies, too few graves, and the ground was frozen too hard for burial anyway. But the coat, the Feldgrau wool coat, it looked intact. No visible damage, and most importantly, it looked warm. Danny found excuses to walk past that tree, checking perimeter, relieving himself, fetching water. Each time he'd glance at the coat. Each time he'd calculate. Regulation violation versus functional fingers, court-martial versus amputation. The mathematics weren't complicated. But taking it felt like crossing a line, not just breaking a rule, but admitting something darker, that the army had failed them, that survival meant ignoring orders, that the only way to keep fighting was to dress like the enemy they were supposed to kill. On the afternoon of December 22nd, Danny's squad mate Peters came back from patrol. Peters was tough, never complained, never showed weakness. But when he pulled off his gloves to eat, Danny saw his fingertips, white, bloodless, the first stage of frostbite. Peters noticed Danny staring. He looked down at his own hands, then back at Danny. Neither of them said anything. Peters put his gloves back on and went to find the medic. That night, Danny couldn't sleep. Not because of the cold, though it was brutal. Because he kept thinking about Peter's white fingertips, about Charlie's missing toes, about Rodriguez's hands wrapped in bandages. He thought about the German coat 30 yards away. And he thought about something his father had told him before he shipped out. Rules are important, son, but so is coming home. At 0400 hours, Danny made his decision. Danny waited until the guard rotation changed. He waited until most of the squad was asleep or focused on other sectors. He waited until there was a narrow window where walking toward that tree wouldn't draw immediate attention. Then he stood up, checked his rifle, and walked like he had a purpose. The German soldier had frozen in place, body rigid against the tree trunk. Danny didn't look at the face. He'd learned that lesson early. Bodies were easier to handle when you didn't see them as people. He focused on the coat. Feldgrau wool, the distinctive field gray color that every American soldier had been trained to recognize at distance. Heavy buttons, reinforced shoulders, high collar designed to protect the neck. Danny crouched down and examined the construction. This wasn't just thicker wool. This was engineering. The Germans had designed this coat with specific intent, multiple layers. The outer shell was dense wool, treated to repel moisture. Beneath that, a quilted liner that trapped air for insulation. The pockets were deeper than American coats, positioned to allow hands to stay warm while still being functional. The cuffs had adjustable straps to seal against cold air infiltration. This was equipment designed by people who understood winter as a tactical problem requiring technical solutions. Danny unbuttoned the coat carefully. The German had been roughly his size, maybe slightly taller. The coat would fit. He pulled it free from the frozen body, trying not to think about the fact that a man had died wearing this. The wool was stiff from cold but undamaged. No bullet holes, no blood. The soldier had probably died from artillery concussion or shrapnel that hit somewhere else. The coat was heavy in Danny's hands, substantially heavier than his M1943 jacket. That weight was insulation. That weight was warmth. That weight was the difference between keeping his fingers and losing them. He held it for a long moment, calculating one final time. If he put this on, he was making a visible statement. There was no hiding a German coat. The color was wrong. The cut was wrong. The buttons were wrong. Everyone would know. His squad would know. His sergeant would know. Any officer who walked by would know. But Peter's white fingertips flashed in Danny's mind. Charlie's missing toes. Rodriguez's bandaged hands. The medic's expression every time another man came in with cold injury. That look of tired resignation that said this keeps happening and nobody's stopping it. Danny put the coat on. The difference was immediate and shocking. The German wool was thick enough that wind didn't penetrate. The high collar protected his neck, an area the American jacket left exposed. The sleeves were long enough to cover his wrists completely. Within 30 seconds, Danny could feel his body heat being trapped and held, not escaping into frozen air. This was what warmth felt like. He'd almost forgotten. Danny buttoned the coat and started walking back to his position. He made it maybe 20 feet before he realized the magnitude of what he'd just done. He was an American soldier wearing an enemy uniform in an active combat zone. If Germans saw him at distance, they might think he was one of theirs. Friendly fire risk. If Americans saw him at distance, same problem from the opposite direction. And if any officer saw him up close, he was looking at formal charges. But his fingers. For the first time in days, his fingers felt normal. The wooden sensation was already fading. He could flex them properly. He could feel them. Danny reached his foxhole and climbed in. Sergeant Kowalski was awake, sitting 20 feet away, smoking a cigarette. Their eyes met across the darkness. Kowalski looked at the German coat. Danny looked back, waiting for the order to take it off, waiting for the reprimand. Kowalski took a long drag on his cigarette, exhaled slowly, and looked away. Permission. Sort of. At least, non-interference. Danny settled into his foxhole wearing enemy wool and felt warmth for the first time since arriving in Belgium. He understood now why the Germans could hold positions longer, why their soldiers seemed more effective in winter combat. It wasn't superior training or better tactics. It was superior equipment. They simply weren't fighting hypothermia and the enemy simultaneously. The coat had internal pockets Danny hadn't noticed before. Deep pockets, lined with softer material. He explored them carefully and found something the previous owner had left behind. A small notebook. Danny pulled it out and opened to the first page. German handwriting, neat and precise. A name, Gerhard Müller. An address in Hamburg. A date, November 1944. Danny closed the notebook and put it back. He didn't want to know about Gerhard Müller, didn't want to know if he had family, if he wrote letters home, if he missed someone. The coat was equipment now. Tools don't have stories. For the next 3 days, Danny wore the German coat continuously. He wore it on patrol. He wore it in the foxhole. He wore it during meals and during guard duty. And slowly, quietly, his squad stopped pretending not to notice. First, it was just glances, then nods. Then, on the second day, Williams approached him during a break and asked where he'd found it. Danny pointed toward the tree. Williams walked that direction and came back 30 minutes later wearing a German scarf. By the third day, half the squad had acquired something. German gloves, German wool caps. One guy found an entire German winter uniform and wore it under his American jacket. Nobody talked about it. Nobody acknowledged it. But the unspoken agreement was clear. Survive first, follow regulations second. That's when the officer arrived. Not their usual lieutenant. Someone from division headquarters. Someone who'd spent the last week in a heated building reviewing reports. Someone who walked into their frozen position wearing a clean American uniform and noticed immediately that something was very, very wrong. Captain Harrison was from Virginia, and he wore his uniform like it mattered. Crisp edges despite the field conditions, boots polished to a shine that seemed impossible in Belgian mud. He walked through the position with a clipboard, conducting what he called a morale and readiness assessment. What that actually meant was checking whether frontline soldiers were following regulations that men in heated offices thought were important. He spotted Danny's coat from 30 feet away. Harrison stopped mid-stride, stared, and walked directly toward Danny's foxhole. His face showed the particular expression officers got when they saw something that offended their sense of order. Not anger exactly. More like discovering someone had reorganized a filing system incorrectly. "Soldier, what unit are you with?" Danny stood at attention as best he could in a foxhole. "Second Squad, Baker Company, sir." "And that coat you're wearing, explain." There was no point in lying. The coat was obviously German. The color gave it away even if nothing else did. Danny kept his voice neutral, factual. "Scavenged from enemy casualties, sir. December 22nd. You're aware that wearing enemy uniform components is a violation of standing orders? Yes, sir. Harrison made a note on his clipboard. How long have you been wearing it? 3 days, sir. 3 days. Harrison looked around the position, really seeing it now. His eyes caught on Williams's German scarf, on Peter's German gloves, on Jackson's German wool cap barely visible under his American helmet. The captain's jaw tightened. Is your entire squad out of uniform? Sergeant Kowalski materialized from a nearby foxhole. He didn't salute. Too close to the front line, too much sniper risk. Sir, permission to speak? Go ahead, Sergeant. These men have been in position for 18 days, nighttime temperatures averaging 15 degrees. We've evacuated 3 soldiers for cold weather injuries. No additional winter equipment available through supply. The men improvised. Harrison's expression didn't change. The men violated direct orders about enemy equipment. There are reasons for those orders, Sergeant. Friendly fire risk, unit cohesion, chain of command integrity. Kowalski nodded slowly. Understood, sir. How many men has your headquarters evacuated for frostbite this month? The question landed like a grenade. Harrison's face flushed slightly. That's not relevant to... 16 from Baker Company alone, sir. Another 23 from Charlie Company. We're losing more men to cold than to enemy action in this sector. Kowalski's voice remained respectful, but there was steel underneath. The German equipment works. Ours doesn't. Not in these temperatures. Harrison looked at his clipboard, then at the squad, then back at his notes. He was calculating something, not tactical math, political math, how to handle this without it becoming a larger problem. The regulations exist for valid operational reasons. Yes, sir, Kowalski agreed. So does winning the war. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Danny stood in his foxhole wearing Feldgrau wool, watching an officer from headquarters wrestle with the gap between policy and reality. Harrison could enforce the regulation, order every man to remove enemy equipment immediately, document the violations, and send reports up the chain. Follow procedure exactly as written. But then what? The cold wouldn't stop. The Army-issue coats wouldn't suddenly become warmer. More men would lose fingers and toes, and Harrison would have to explain to his superiors why he prioritized uniform compliance over combat effectiveness. Harrison clicked his pen twice, a nervous habit. The official position is that U.S. personnel will not wear enemy uniforms or insignia. That position hasn't changed. Understood, sir. However, Harrison paused, choosing his words carefully. Temporary field modifications to address extreme weather conditions, utilizing available materials, falls under discretionary command authority for unit survival. It took Danny a moment to translate. Harrison was giving them permission. Sort of, not officially. But he was creating bureaucratic language that let him look the other way without technically violating his own orders. Equipment acquired from enemy casualties will be documented as salvage for intelligence purposes, Harrison continued, still writing on his clipboard. Utilization of said salvage for weather protection is considered a temporary field expedient pending proper supply chain restoration. Kowalski nodded. Understood completely, sir. Harrison finished writing and looked directly at Danny. That coat. If you're wearing it in combat, you paint a white cross on the back, medical marker, something that identifies you as U.S. personnel at distance. Otherwise, you're creating a friendly fire hazard. Yes, sir. And if anyone above division asks about this, you found those items abandoned in a supply depot, not taken from bodies. Understand? Yes, sir. Harrison closed his clipboard and surveyed the position one more time. His eyes lingered on the frozen ground, the inadequate foxholes, the soldiers who looked 20 years older than their actual ages. Whatever he saw seemed to settle something in his mind. Carry on, Sergeant. Yes, sir. Harrison walked away, back toward wherever warm headquarters buildings existed. He'd been in the position maybe 10 minutes, long enough to see the problem, long enough to make a calculation, not long enough to actually freeze. After he disappeared, Williams emerged from his foxhole and looked at Danny. Did that just happen? I think so, Danny replied. Kowalski lit another cigarette and smiled grimly. Welcome to war, boys, where reality eventually overrules the paperwork. But Danny wasn't celebrating yet. Because Harrison's compromise only worked if it stayed quiet. If word spread, if other units started doing the same thing on a larger scale, if photographs reached newspapers back home showing American soldiers dressed in German wool, then the political calculation would change. And Harrison's bureaucratic permission would evaporate. The question was whether Danny's squad could keep this quiet, and whether other squads, freezing in their own positions, would figure out the same solution before someone higher up decided to make an example out of somebody. Word traveled fast in combat zones, just not through official channels. A soldier from Charlie Company saw Danny wearing the German coat during a supply run. Didn't say anything, just looked, nodded, and filed the information away. 2 days later, 3 men from Charlie Company were wearing German wool caps. A week after that, entire squads across the sector had quietly acquired enemy winter gear. Nobody talked about it openly. Nobody filed reports. It spread the way practical solutions always spread among soldiers through observation, imitation, and mutual understanding that survival mattered more than paperwork. Danny became something of an unintentional expert on German winter equipment. Other soldiers would ask him questions. Where did he find it? How did he know it would fit? What should they look for? Danny would answer matter-of-factly, like he was explaining how to clean a rifle. Check the shoulders for your build. Make sure there's no blood or damage. Feldgrau wool is heavier than American issue. Takes time to get used to the weight. He started noticing details he hadn't seen before. The German coat had small loops sewn inside, designed to attach additional layers if needed. The buttons were positioned to allow overlap, creating a double barrier against wind. The collar could be raised and secured with hidden snaps, protecting the entire neck and lower face. Every element served a specific anti-cold function. This wasn't just thicker fabric. This was systematic engineering applied to the problem of keeping humans functional in hostile temperatures. Danny learned that German winter doctrine came from brutal experience on the Eastern Front. Russian winters killed tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers in 1941 and 1942. The German military studied those deaths the way engineers study structural failures. They identified exactly how cold killed, exactly which body parts failed first, exactly what temperatures caused what types of damage. Then, they redesigned their equipment accordingly. The Americans hadn't had that experience. The U.S. military had fought in North Africa, Italy, and France, warm climates mostly. The Ardennes winter caught them unprepared, not because of incompetence, but because they'd never faced this specific problem before. German soldiers knew. They'd lived through Russian cold that made Belgian winter look mild. They'd learned that equipment mattered as much as courage, that you couldn't fight effectively if you were fighting hypothermia simultaneously. Danny understood now why captured German prisoners sometimes looked confused when they saw American gear. To them, the Americans were dressed for autumn. They probably wondered how the U.S. Army expected its soldiers to function in these conditions. By early January, the temperature had dropped even further, single digits at night, barely above freezing during the day. The German coat kept Danny functional. His fingers worked. His core temperature stayed stable. He could hold his rifle properly, could operate equipment without fumbling, could think clearly without the constant distraction of cold. Meanwhile, soldiers still wearing only U.S. issue gear continued to struggle. Danny watched a replacement arrive from England, fresh-faced kid named Morrison, not related to the Charlie who'd lost his toes. New Morrison lasted 4 days before his hands turned white, evacuated for frostbite before he'd even fired his weapon in combat. The system was failing these men, but the men had found a solution. That solution just happened to involve wearing the enemy's colors. Sergeant Kowalski pulled Danny aside one afternoon in mid-January. They stood in a supply trench, supposedly checking inventory, actually having a conversation they needed to keep private. "Division's getting nervous," Kowalski said quietly. "Too many soldiers wearing German gear. It's becoming visible. Photographs are reaching rear echelon and people are asking questions." Danny nodded. He'd known this was coming. The arrangement only worked if it stayed small, quiet, deniable. Once it became widespread, it became a political problem. Captain Harrison bought us time, Kowalski continued, but his authority only covers so much. If a colonel or a general shows up and sees half the battalion dressed like Wehrmacht, Harrison can't protect that. What do we do? Kowalski shrugged. Keep your head down, don't make it obvious, and hope winter ends before someone decides to make this a discipline issue. That same night, Danny was on guard duty when he heard voices, American voices, but coming from the wrong direction. He tensed, rifle ready, trying to identify who was approaching in the darkness. Then he heard the password challenge and response. Friendly patrol, but from a different sector. 3 soldiers emerged from the tree line, all 3 wearing German coats. They saw Danny's Feldgrau wool and relaxed visibly. One of them grinned. Guess we're not the only ones. Guess not, Danny replied. They didn't linger. Wrong sector, wrong unit, potential security issue. But the encounter confirmed what Danny had suspected. This wasn't isolated anymore. This was systematic. Across the entire Ardennes front, American soldiers were quietly abandoning regulation uniforms in favor of German equipment that actually worked. The problem was scale. A few soldiers here and there could be ignored, could be rationalized as field expedients, but hundreds, maybe thousands, that became a story. That became something newspapers might report. That became political. Danny thought about Harrison's carefully chosen words. Temporary field expedient pending proper supply chain restoration. That language only worked if the situation remained temporary. If spring came, if the cold broke, if proper U.S. winter gear eventually arrived, then this would fade into forgotten history. But if winter lasted, if the cold persisted, if more men froze, then the pressure to either authorize or forbid this practice would become unbearable. Someone would have to make an official decision, and Danny suspected that decision would prioritize image over effectiveness. 2 days later, the situation nearly collapsed. A photographer from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, arrived to document frontline conditions. He was shooting routine morale photos, soldiers cleaning weapons, playing cards, writing letters home. Standard propaganda material to show folks back home that the boys were doing fine. Then he saw the German coats, 12 of them in one position, all clearly visible in his camera frame. The photographer lowered his camera slowly and looked at Sergeant Kowalski. Sarge, those coats, that's not regulation, right?" Kowalski's expression didn't change. "Those are salvaged wool garments acquired through field resource utilization for extreme weather mitigation. They're German uniforms. They're wool." The photographer looked through his viewfinder again, studying the scene. He was calculating. Danny could see it. The photos would be dramatic, would certainly get attention, would raise questions someone would have to answer. Finally, the photographer clicked his camera case shut. "How cold does it get at night?" "Last night was 6 degrees, Kowalski replied. "And what's the standard issue supposed to handle?" "Maybe 30 degrees. Comfortably." The photographer nodded slowly and put his camera away without taking any more shots. "I never saw those coats, Sergeant. As far as my photo log shows, I documented equipment maintenance and routine patrol operations. Nothing else." "Appreciate that." After the photographer left, Danny exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. They'd dodged exposure by maybe 5 minutes. But how long before the next photographer arrived? Before someone less sympathetic documented the situation? Before the wrong officer decided this violated something they cared about? The German coat had kept Danny alive through the worst winter of his life. It had saved his fingers, his effectiveness, possibly his life. But that practical solution was becoming a political liability. And Danny was starting to wonder whether survival or regulations would win. The summons came on January 14th, 1945. Private Danny Cole was ordered to report to battalion headquarters immediately. He walked 3 miles through frozen mud to a farmhouse where Colonel Thomas Brennan sat behind a desk with Danny's German coat laid out like evidence. "Private Cole," Brennan's voice was neutral. I understand you've been wearing this for 3 weeks. Yes, sir. Brennan studied the coat, running his hand over the wool. It's well made, substantially warmer than what we provide. He looked up. I've been receiving reports, initially from Captain Harrison, but then more, from other companies. Your solution has become popular. Danny said nothing. In your assessment, is U.S. issue winter equipment adequate for these conditions? The question was direct. Danny answered the same way. No, sir. The M1943 jacket doesn't hold body heat below 20 degrees. Soldiers are losing fingers and toes faster than we're losing men to enemy action in this sector. Brennan nodded. 63 men evacuated for cold weather injuries in 3 weeks, nearly a full company's strength. He gestured to the coat. What makes the German equipment superior? Danny relaxed slightly. This was engineering talk, not interrogation. Denser wool, sir. Multiple layers that trap air. Wind-blocking construction. The Germans learned this on the Eastern Front after losing thousands to Russian winter. They redesigned everything. We didn't learn it because we've been fighting in warmer climates. And we're paying for that now. Brennan sat back. Private Cole, I have a problem. Regulations prohibit wearing enemy uniforms, but my combat effectiveness is being destroyed by inadequate equipment. Soldiers solved problem 2 by violating problem 1. He paused. What would you do? The question surprised Danny. Sir, I'd document it as field expedient cold weather adaptation, require marking for friendly fire prevention, and submit urgent requisition for proper gear while being honest about why it's needed. Be honest that our equipment is failing? Yes, sir. Brennan smiled grimly. That honesty won't be popular with procurement officers, but you're right. He handed the coat back. You're being reassigned to battalion logistics as cold weather equipment consultant. Document what works and what doesn't, interview soldiers, examine equipment, provide technical recommendations. I'll deliver those recommendations to Division Supply personally. Sir, I'm not qualified. You kept your fingers in conditions that cost 63 others theirs. That makes you qualified. Brennan's voice hardened. German equipment continues as temporary field expedient. All items marked with U.S. identification. The moment proper American gear arrives, German equipment gets turned in. Understood? Yes, sir. Over 2 weeks, Danny interviewed soldiers across the battalion. He documented German equipment functionality, sketched designs, measured insulation, learned that German wool socks had reinforced heels preventing blisters. German gloves had removable liners allowing fine motor control. German scarves were long enough to wrap multiple times. The Germans hadn't made better equipment through superior engineering. They'd made it through worse experience. They'd learned from lethal mistakes. Americans were experiencing those same conditions now. Danny's report was 37 pages, technical diagrams, temperature data, casualty statistics. He submitted it January 29th. Brennan read it in one sitting, then called Danny back. Excellent work. Comprehensive, practical, honest. He set it down. It will also be completely ignored by everyone above division. Sir, the problems require procurement changes taking months, new designs, contracts, manufacturing. By the time equipment reaches here, winter will be over. Brennan sighed. Your report will be filed for next year's planning. It will prevent this problem in future winters, but it won't help us now. So the German equipment remains our best option, unofficially, quietly, temporarily. Brennan handed the report back. Keep this. After the war, someone will want to know why soldiers scavenged enemy equipment to survive. This explains it. Danny returned to his unit 2 days later. The German coat still worked. His fingers still functioned. Across the battalion, hundreds wore Feldgrau wool because the alternative was losing pieces of themselves. Spring came in March. Temperatures rose. German equipment quietly disappeared from positions. Some soldiers turned it in. Some buried it. Some kept it. Danny kept his coat. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. Danny Cole was in Germany when the announcement came. Soldiers celebrated. Some cried. Some sat silent. Danny felt relief, exhaustion. He'd survived with all his fingers and toes, which put him ahead of 63 men from his battalion who hadn't. The German coat was still in his pack. He hadn't worn it since March when temperatures rose, but he'd kept it. Not as trophy, just as equipment that worked. If you've made it this far and want more untold WBAO2 survival stories, subscribe. Because the practical ones don't make the history books. The Army discharged Danny in July. No medals for surviving winter, just a handshake, train ticket home, and a duffel bag containing everything he owned, including one Feldgrau coat that wasn't supposed to exist. He returned to Montana, small town called Whitehall. His father ran a hardware store. Danny went back to work there like he'd never left. People asked about the war sometimes. Danny's responses were brief. Cold mostly. Got through it. Nobody pressed. Montana had sent many boys to war. Most didn't want to talk much either. Danny married in 1947, girl named Ruth from the post office, 2 daughters and a son, built a house on the edge of town, lived quietly, raised kids, fixed things. The German coat hung in his closet. Ruth asked about it once. "That's not Army issue, is it?" "German," Danny replied. "Kept me from losing my fingers." "Should you have kept it?" Danny shrugged. "Probably not, but I did." Every fall when hunting season started, Danny pulled out the German coat. It still worked. The wool hadn't degraded. He'd wear it in the mountains tracking deer, and the coat kept him warm through October cold and November snow. His hunting partner Roberts, who'd served in the Pacific, noticed. "That's German, isn't it?" "Yeah." "You take that off a prisoner?" "Dead soldier. Belgium, 1944. Roberts nodded and didn't ask more. He understood. War made you practical about things. Danny wore that coat hunting every year for 40 years, wore it teaching his son to shoot, wore it fixing neighbors' fence lines in winter. It outlasted 3 American coats he bought at the hardware store. German engineers had built something that lasted. In 1985, Danny's grandson Michael was visiting. 16, curious about everything. He found the coat in his grandfather's closet, heavy, gray, unfamiliar buttons. "Grandpa, what's this?" Danny looked up from his newspaper. "German Army coat from the war." Michael examined it. "You're allowed to have this?" "Probably not, but I never gave it back." "Why not?" Danny set down his newspaper. He was 70, a lifetime from frozen Belgian foxholes, but he remembered the cold, Charlie's missing toes, Peter's white fingertips, the choice between regulations and fingers. "Army sent us to Belgium in winter with equipment for autumn. Men were losing fingers to frostbite. That coat kept me warm enough to function, kept my hands working, probably saved my life." "But it was against the rules?" "Yeah." "So you broke the rules?" Danny considered the question. "I chose my hands over the rules. Seemed like a fair trade." Michael put the coat back carefully. "Did you get in trouble?" "Sort of, then not really. Colonel decided survival was more important than regulations." Danny picked up his newspaper. "The coat worked. That's what mattered. Still works." Danny died in 1987 at 72. Heart attack while fixing a fence line in November, wearing the German coat. Quick. He didn't suffer. Michael asked to keep the coat. He wore it hunting for 20 more years, just like his grandfather. Eventually, it wore out. Even German engineering couldn't last forever. But Michael kept it anyway, folded in a trunk. The official U.S. Army history mentions cold weather casualties, 63 from Danny's battalion, hundreds across the Ardennes. Reports recommend improved gear for future operations. The reports don't mention soldiers solved the problem themselves by wearing enemy equipment. That detail stayed in classified memos for 30 years, then was quietly forgotten. Danny Cole never appeared in military histories, never gave interviews, never claimed he'd done anything special. He'd fixed things his whole life, hardware, fences, equipment. The German coat was just another practical solution to a simple problem. How do you keep hands from freezing when issued equipment doesn't work? The answer was, you broke the rules. Quietly. Practically. Without drama, you put on the coat that worked and survived another day. Danny never called himself a hero. He fixed hardware in Montana and wore a German coat while hunting. That was his war story. Simple, practical, true.